A peaceful morning in the countryside took a sudden turn when a farmer surveying his land stumbled upon something unusual. In a relatively remote area, overgrown with bushes and uneven terrain, his attention was drawn to suspicious shapes resembling a human skeleton. Police quickly secured the area, ensuring no evidence was disturbed. Forensic specialists, well versed in the painstaking process of exhumation, arrived to carefully examine the scene, knowing that even the smallest detail could be the key to solving the mystery. When the official announcement confirmed that the remains belonged to Kelly Dwyer, the weight of the revelation hit the local community hard. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. This real documentary will be about Kelly Dwyer. Was born in 1986 and grew up in a smaller community outside Milwaukee, Wisconsin. From an early age, she showed a friendly, outgoing personality and a genuine curiosity about the world. Her family and close friends recall her as someone who could light up a room with her warm smile and easy laughter. After high school, she briefly considered moving out of state for college, but ultimately decided to stay closer to home, hoping to balance her studies with work. As she entered her 20s, Kelly's natural sociability led her to discover a love of customer-focused jobs, including roles in retail and service industries. She had an eye for style and enjoyed helping people feel confident in their appearance. Her friends often described her as the person who could chat with anyone and make them feel at ease. By the time she turned 27, Kelly had settled into a modest apartment in Milwaukee. Although she continued to hold retail positions, most recently at a boutique that sold contemporary clothing, she still harbored dreams of furthering her education or possibly starting a small business of her own one day. Her co-workers and managers appreciated her reliability and her warm demeanor with customers. In mid-2013, Kelly began dating Chris Sacco, a man who lived in a more upscale section of downtown Milwaukee. While little is known publicly about the early stage of their relationship, those who saw them together recall that Kelly seemed happy, enjoying the excitement of dating someone whose lifestyle was a bit faster-paced than her own. On October 5, 2013, Kelly finished her shift at the boutique. That Friday night, she clocked out shortly after 8, gave a quick wave to the coworker who was locking up behind her, and stepped into the cool autumn air with an offhand text to a friend mentioning she would be spending the evening at her boyfriend's place. There was no sign of any apprehension in her last messages. Over the next few days, though, Kelly's normally responsive phone went silent, and that in itself sparked the first stirrings of concern among her friends. Initially, they tried to quell their worries by reminding each other how spontaneous Kelly could be. She had, after all, driven off on short hiking trips before with minimal notice. Yet as one day of silence stretched into two, and she missed a scheduled weekend shift that she was never known to skip, alarm bells started ringing. Her mother, who lived in another part of Wisconsin, felt an indescribable maternal dread when repeated calls and texts to Kelly's phone went unanswered. By Monday, Kelly's manager at the boutique pointed out that she had failed to appear at work for 2 consecutive days, utterly unlike the usually punctual and committed employee. With growing urgency, Kelly's mother and a close friend arrived at the local police station to file a missing person report. The officers took their information, but with the typical cautious protocol surrounding adults who vanish, they reminded everyone that Kelly might have left voluntarily, urging a bit more time. Despite that standard approach, those who knew Kelly best were adamant that something was off. She was socially active, yes, and open to adventure, but she was also devoted to her friends and job. Within days, the conversation around Kelly's disappearance had expanded beyond her immediate circle to coworkers, casual acquaintances, and even local businesses. The boutique where she worked helped print missing person flyers featuring a clear headshot of her, beaming in a floral sundress. Soon, these posters were taped to telephone poles, pinned on community boards at coffee shops, and affixed to the windows of local diners, each urging anyone with information to come forward. People scanning the flyer learned that Kelly had last been seen in the early hours of October 5th, entering a downtown apartment building via its lobby door, captured by a security camera that never recorded her leaving. That fact alone, the absence of any footage documenting her departure, stoked immediate speculation. Did she slip out another exit, or did something sinister happen behind those closed doors? Meanwhile, local news stations began covering the story more prominently, sending reporters to stand outside the apartment building with a microphone in hand, delivering somber updates on the evening news. They played grainy clips from the security footage that showed Kelly stepping inside, wearing jeans, a light jacket, and carrying a small purse, looking entirely normal for a Friday night. The question no one could answer was what became of her once she crossed that threshold. Days turned into weeks, and the tension ratcheted higher with every fruitless lead. Kelly's friends formed small search parties, canvassing local bars, parks, and overlooked corners of Milwaukee in hopes of spotting anything that could hint at her whereabouts. The police, by that point, had stepped up their efforts as well. They began interviewing her boyfriend Chris Sacco more thoroughly, noting that he was the last known person to see Kelly alive. His story, repeated to friends and investigators, was that she left his apartment at some point early that morning and that he had no idea where she went afterward. But without camera footage of her departure or a clear timeline of text messages from her phone, it was difficult to confirm or deny his account. Investigators also pulled phone records, bank statements, and social media activity, scouring for any sign of digital footprints. Yet none of it offered a conclusive clue. Kelly's accounts showed no suspicious transactions, and her phone pinged its last known location near that downtown area, a detail that fit with what little they already knew. Unfortunately, the passing hours only compounded the sense of dread that hung over her family. As the second week ended, local newspapers began featuring the story on their front pages, some giving it a headline that read, "Missing in Milwaukee, where is Kelly Dwyer?" As the search continued, unverified rumors multiplied. Someone claimed to have seen Kelly at a gas station late one night 2 counties away. Another insisted she had traveled out of state with an unknown companion. But each new lead failed to produce results. The police publicly stressed that their investigation remained active, urging anyone who might have been in the downtown neighborhood near the time of her disappearance to come forward if they'd seen or heard anything unusual. Despite the heightened attention, the case seemed stuck in place, generating almost as many questions as it did fear. Nonetheless, the neighborhood where Kelly's boyfriend lived remained a focal point of speculation. The building's management cooperated with the police, turning over whatever footage they had, but it offered no clear answers. Meanwhile, the city braced itself for a harsh winter, the temperature dropping as if mirroring the sense of despair. The unanswered question remained stark. How could a vibrant young woman known by so many just vanish without a trace in a place lined with surveillance cameras? The first task enforcement was to confirm that Kelly's vanishing was indeed out of character. However, this lack of clarity only made investigators more determined to probe deeper, convinced that the last person to see Kelly, and the site where she was last known to be, held vital answers. In the early stages of the investigation, officers interviewed Chris multiple times, making careful note of any inconsistencies or gaps in his story. He described a routine evening. Kelly arrived. They chatted. They might have ordered takeout. He couldn't recall exactly. And they watched some television before going to bed. According to Chris, nothing about Kelly's behavior raised alarm. She neither argued nor showed signs of distress. He claimed that after sleeping for a few hours, she indicated she was heading home, and that was the last time he saw her. The detectives took down his version of events, but simultaneously requested a warrant to search his apartment for any physical evidence that could indicate whether Kelly had truly left on her own. At first, the search uncovered no obvious signs of a struggle, no bloodstains, no obvious disarray that might suggest violence. Yet the police removed certain items for further testing, including bedding and electronics, hoping that forensic analysis would turn up a trace of Kelly, or at least confirm or contradict Chris's timeline. While these steps were routine for a missing person case involving potential foul play, the sense of uncertainty in Kelly's circle of loved ones blossomed into an acute dread. Each day she remained missing amplified the likelihood that she had met with harm. A few neighbors recalled hearing muffled voices or a door slamming late that night, but no one could definitively tie such noise to Kelly, and certainly no one had seen her leaving. The case grew more perplexing when it was revealed that the building had multiple cameras but still failed to document Kelly's exit. Investigators asked themselves if there might be a blind spot, a service entrance, or some mishap in the timestamps that caused them to miss footage. Despite combing through hours of recordings, they found no conclusive evidence that Kelly ever stepped beyond that lobby again. The tension grew sharper when, during a subsequent search of Chris's apartment triggered by what investigators coyly referred to as additional probable cause, police discovered something that took the investigation in a disturbing new direction: evidence of the presence of intimate videos on several electronic devices. Word of the discovery leaked before official charges were filed, stoking the public's fears that Chris might be capable of far darker acts than anyone had initially suspected. Once these allegations reached the media, Chris's name became inextricably tied to two horrifying ideas: a missing girlfriend and the possession of illegal sexual content. The city's conversation about Kelly's disappearance began to mix with revulsion at the possibility that Chris's private life concealed something far more twisted than a typical relationship gone wrong. Detectives had to balance these new revelations with the original goal of finding Kelly, or at least understanding what had happened to her. Although the pornography charges were separate, the very fact that Chris had concealed such material raised red flags about his credibility and moral compass. Investigators pored over his emails, browser history, and messaging apps, searching for mention of Kelly, potential communications with third parties that might reveal her whereabouts, or contradictory statements that could be used if the case ever went to trial. With law enforcement calling in acquaintances, co-workers, or anyone who had socialized with the couple, aiming to determine whether there had been any telling shift in Chris's behavior. Was he known to be controlling, prone to jealousy, or involved in risk-taking activities that could spiral into a more dangerous scenario? Some acquaintances mentioned that Chris had bragged about access to prohibited substances, which, though not uncommon in certain circles, offered a fresh angle. Suspicions intensified when, during yet another round of searches and interviews, the police confirmed Chris also faced potential drug charges, having discovered paraphernalia and quantities of illegal substances in his possession. Nevertheless, the prohibited substances charges were enough to keep him entangled in the legal system, and he soon found himself in custody, facing bail hearings that the prosecution argued should be stringent, given the severity of the offenses. The police quietly ramped up their more direct investigative work surrounding Kelly's last known hours. They scrutinized phone logs and location data to confirm whether Chris's device traveled anywhere unusual that night or in the days following. They sent out specialized teams to comb through areas he might have frequented, from remote fields and wooded patches outside the city to industrial areas closer to downtown, hoping to uncover any trace that might link him to her disappearance. Local news bulletins were flooded with calls from citizens who claimed to have leads, but most were dead ends. A person who thought they saw Kelly at a highway rest stop, or someone who believed they recognized her from a blurred photograph on social media. The police dutifully followed each tip, only to return to the same unnerving silence. No confirmed sightings, no new evidence, and a tight-lipped suspect who blamed everything on either coincidence or an unfortunate series of misunderstandings. By the turn of the year, the district attorney's office had already filed multiple counts against Chris for the prohibited substances offenses. Behind the scenes, prosecutors conferred with detectives about the possibility of employing these charges as leverage, hoping to pressure Chris into revealing what he knew about Kelly's fate. However, any hopes that he might crack under legal pressure were dashed when he steadfastly maintained that he had zero involvement in her disappearance. His lawyers, likely realizing the significance of any statement regarding Kelly, advised him to remain silent on that subject. While Chris's court dates for the prohibited substances charges were scheduled, the Milwaukee Police Department pressed on, seeking to fill every hole in the timeline, re-canvassing neighbors, rechecking parking garage footage, and making repeated appeals for fresh leads. In late spring of 2015, roughly a year and a half after Kelly Dwyer's disappearance, the Milwaukee community was jolted from a tense, sorrowful waiting game into a new wave of shock when word broke those human remains had been discovered in a rural stretch of Jefferson County, about an hour's drive from the city, and that investigators were converging on the site in hopes of answering the grim question that had haunted everyone for so long. The details initially trickling out were guarded and incomplete. A property owner in a relatively remote expanse of farmland had stumbled upon what seemed to be skeletal remains, partially obscured by brush and uneven terrain. The land, dotted with patches of tall grass and scattered stands of trees, was not the sort of place one might casually pass through on a daily basis, so it felt heartbreaking to imagine how long those remains might have been there, lying undiscovered while Kelly's family and friends clung to a fading hope that she might somehow reappear alive. Law enforcement acted swiftly, cordoning off the area and dispatching forensic specialists who were well-versed in the painstaking process of exhuming evidence from the outdoors, aware that any minor detail, a stray fiber, a particular brand of duct tape, or a personal item, could illuminate the cause of death, or, at the very least, confirm the identity of the person who had been left there in such an unceremonious way. Though the authorities did not publicly confirm it right away, rumors spread almost instantly that this anonymous figure was, in fact, Kelly. For many who had followed her case since October 2013, there was an almost fatalistic sense that the timing, the location, and the condition of the remains made it unlikely to be anyone else. Nevertheless, the official identification required methodical comparison of dental records and, potentially, DNA samples, a process that demanded not only scientific precision but also patience from a family desperate for answers. News crews descended on the scene, filming clusters of uniformed officers moving slowly across the property with handheld search equipment, expressionless and grim in the face of what they might find. When the final word came that the remains did indeed belong to Kelly Dwyer, it landed like a sledgehammer on a community that had, in many ways, grown emotionally invested in her plight. On the one hand, the discovery brought a sliver of relief to those who had feared she would remain missing forever, her loved ones deprived of the closure that can come only when a body is found and laid to rest. On the other hand, this moment carried the crushing heartbreak of confirmation. There would be no miraculous reappearance, no joyous reunion, just the stark truth that Kelly had died violently or unexpectedly, and that someone, presumably, had gone to great lengths to hide her body. Official statements from the Milwaukee Police Department were terse but resolute. They were treating the discovery as a crucial turning point, certain that forensic evidence would provide vital clues about the manner and time of Kelly's death. Almost immediately, attention swung back to the man who had long been the central figure of suspicion. Chris, her boyfriend at the time of her disappearance. Yet the question now became whether the physical evidence recovered in Jefferson County might finally tie him to her death beyond circumstantial inferences. Although the police remained tight-lipped about any specifics, local journalists reported that certain personal effects found near or with Kelly's remains had been bagged and sent off to the state crime lab for DNA testing, a step that investigators hoped could link Chris to the disposal site or, conversely, open up the possibility that someone else might have been involved. Complicating matters was the advanced state of decomposition. Kelly had been missing for over a year and a half, and the frigid Wisconsin winters and humid summers could wreak havoc on forensic details. Identifying a cause of death, strangulation, blunt force trauma, or an overdose, would be far trickier now than it might have been had her remains been discovered earlier. Nevertheless, the involvement of experienced forensic pathologists offered some optimism that certain critical markers might still exist, whether in the condition of her bones, residual tissue, or soil samples surrounding the site. With each passing day, more evidence trickled in, but official statements gave the public only vague updates. We continue to analyze new data, or we have reason to believe that additional parties may have information. People asked how someone might have transported her remains to such a secluded area, whether this suggested a level of premeditation or panic, and, inevitably, whether there was a chance that someone else had a hand in the tragedy. Against this backdrop, Kelly's mother chose to speak publicly, flanked by friends holding photographs of Kelly in happier times. She expressed both profound grief and a determination to see justice served, insisting that her daughter's life would not be remembered solely for its tragic ending, but also for the warmth and kindness Kelly had shown in her 27 years. Mourners, some of whom had never even met Kelly, attended vigils to light candles in her memory. Meanwhile, the discovery of Kelly's remains granted the Milwaukee Police Department the impetus to ramp up pressure on Chris. Their logic was straightforward. If they could tie even the smallest physical artifact from the crime scene, like a fiber, a tire track, or a hair sample, to him, they would be far closer to building a homicide case rather than simply suspecting it. Simultaneously, prosecutors from the district attorney's office viewed the discovery as a chance to reopen dialogues about plea deals. Perhaps, they theorized, if faced with the specter of a homicide charge, Chris might at last reveal critical information in exchange for some leniency on other charges. If, that is, the evidence genuinely implicated him. Rumors circulated that Chris's legal team might argue that Kelly died accidentally, due to drug use or some other misadventure, and that he panicked. Yet without forensic evidence pinpointing an overdose, or a note in which Kelly acknowledged a plan to take dangerous substances, such a defense was speculative at best, and the public skepticism ran high. Many believed that if Kelly's death had been purely accidental, there would have been no need to hide her body in a remote rural area and remain silent for over a year. Nevertheless, these swirling theories only underscored the complexity investigators faced. In high-profile cases, the line between fact-finding and rumor-chasing can blur, and the Milwaukee PD had learned the hard way that incomplete public statements can lead to wild conjectures that muddy the truth rather than clarify it. During this time, the discovery site itself was a hive of activity, with forensic anthropologists painstakingly sifting through dirt and debris, photographing every angle, collecting samples for advanced laboratory analysis. This painstaking process took days, and even after the remains were removed, further sweeps of the surrounding terrain continued. Officers wanted to ensure they didn't miss something as seemingly trivial as a scrap of clothing or a piece of jewelry that could hold enormous significance in a courtroom. Locals living near the property reported seeing police cars parked by the side of the road for weeks, and more than a few admitted that the entire ordeal had rattled them. The emotional toll of that decision was incalculable. For months, the family had walked a razor's edge between hope and despair, but the final confirmation of Kelly's identity from dental records forced an acceptance they had tried to stave off. Quietly, in the background, detectives kept pursuing every angle, aware that the window for new leads might be short. Though they withheld specifics, authorities hinted that they had gathered promising leads from the scene. Milwaukee braced for the next phase, a phase that would, everyone hoped, involve real accountability for the person or persons responsible for her death and disposal. After so many false starts, unconfirmed rumors, and heartbreaking dead ends, the city held its breath, knowing that the final resolution might be as brutal as everything that had come before, and yet still necessary if Kelly's family and friends were to find any sense of peace in the midst of an unthinkable tragedy. In the months that followed, the prosecution's case centered on the idea that Chris had both motive and opportunity to harm Kelly. They asserted that she died in his downtown apartment after a night of prohibited substances use, a scenario that, according to their theory, turned deadly due to either an overdose he failed to report or an act of violence that Chris attempted to conceal. They further argued that even if she had died by accidental means, Chris's actions in hiding her body in a remote rural location demonstrated consciousness of guilt and a desperate need to evade the consequences. Before formal charges could be filed, however, the district attorney's office demanded rigorous review of every piece of evidence that might stand up in court. Phone records plotting Chris's location at suspicious hours, his own inconsistent statements about the time Kelly supposedly left his apartment, and any forensic links, such as fibers from her clothing or traces of her DNA, that might have been transferred into his vehicle. Working alongside detectives, the DA scoured hours of police interviews for even the smallest contradiction in Chris's version of events, believing that a pattern of falsehoods could be as damning as any direct piece of physical evidence. The pre-trial hearings provided a glimpse of the evidence prosecutors hoped would convince a jury that Chris was responsible for Kelly's death. Much of it hinged on the damning digital trail. Location data showed Chris's phone leaving the city in the hours after Kelly was last seen, traveling in a direction consistent with Jefferson County, albeit with some gaps that suggested his device might have been turned off or otherwise out of service range. Zacco claimed he drove 160 miles round-trip to buy a half-pound block of cheese for his girlfriend's parents. But investigators say he did it so he could finally dispose of Kelly's body somewhere in rural Wisconsin. Prosecutors also hinted at communications, text messages or internet searches, that they claimed betrayed a man either planning or covering up a fatal incident. The court's initial proceedings saw Chris's defense attorney objecting to the admission of certain materials, branding them as speculative or obtained without proper warrants. The defense posture was clear from the outset. They would accept no blame for Kelly's death unless the prosecution could prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Chris himself had caused her harm. They contended that her prohibited substances use was more extensive than her friends believed, implying that she could have overdosed at his apartment and that he panicked, hiding her body rather than calling for help. A callous act, they admitted, but not necessarily first-degree reckless homicide. This line of argument forced the prosecution to walk a narrow path. On one side, they could not dismiss the possibility of an overdose outright, since forensic experts, owing to the decomposition of Kelly's remains, could not categorically identify the exact cause of death as strangulation, blunt force trauma, or anything else specific. On the other side, the behavior Chris exhibited afterward, allegedly transporting Kelly's body, discarding personal items, and lying to police, constituted, in their view, a strong sign of guilt. Observers of the court proceedings noted that Chris often appeared subdued, occasionally glancing at Kelly's mother but otherwise showing little emotion. The courtroom opening statements revealed the prosecution's central narrative. Chris and Kelly had been using prohibited substances, an activity he commonly engaged in and sometimes pressured her to join, and that under the influence of these substances, she lost consciousness. Rather than seek medical help, Chris allegedly delayed any response, either because he feared police involvement in his prohibited substances dealings, or because there was a violent confrontation between them. Prosecutors argued that by neglecting to call for assistance and then deliberately hiding Kelly's body, Chris demonstrated that he knew he had caused or contributed to her death in some reckless capacity. They also alluded to phone logs that placed him in the Jefferson County vicinity around the time Kelly's phone ceased transmissions entirely. Woven into this framework was the testimony of forensic pathologists who admitted that, while they could not pinpoint a single lethal injury, the condition of Kelly's remains was suggestive of a hasty clandestine burial that no innocent bystander would orchestrate. Chris's defense, for its part, stuck firmly to the overdose scenario. They leaned on the uncertainty in the autopsy findings, arguing that not being able to prove cause of death equated to not being able to prove homicide. They depicted Chris as someone overwhelmed by panic and, yes, moral cowardice, but not a cold-blooded killer. In cross-examinations, they pressed forensic experts to acknowledge the limitations of their findings, pointing out that without definitive signs of strangulation or physical assault, the claim that Chris had intentionally harmed Kelly was purely speculative. Their cross-examinations of police investigators were likewise pointed, zeroing in on the possibility that the department had made up its mind early in the missing person investigation and pursued Chris to the exclusion of other leads. They asked, for instance, whether authorities had fully examined the possibility that Kelly left the apartment on her own and came to harm later, or that someone else entirely might have discovered her in a vulnerable state. These arguments often felt stretched to outside observers, but in a criminal trial where the state must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, even thin narratives can sow uncertainty in jurors' minds. Yet as the trial progressed, the prosecution rolled out what they considered their crown jewel of evidence: a series of text messages, partially recovered by digital forensic specialists, in which Chris hinted at frustrations with Kelly, referencing her alleged reluctance to keep pace with his lifestyle and prohibited substances use. One ominous text was read aloud, in which Chris told a friend that Kelly can't handle what I do, and I'll have to deal with that later, though the defense argued that the statement merely referred to typical relationship bickering. More potentially incriminating were the location pings gleaned from Chris's cell phone, showing his device traveling an unusual route that prosecutors mapped in detail, itemizing approximate times that aligned with the hours after Kelly was last seen alive. They insisted that even if the exact manner of death remained uncertain, Chris's subsequent actions, carefully disposing of her body, offering shifting explanations to friends and investigators, and continuing his life without alerting anyone, constituted the essence of reckless homicide. The defense retorted that moral repugnance did not necessarily equate to legal guilt of homicide. If Kelly overdosed, disposing of her body was indeed an abhorrent act, but not synonymous with murder. Each side pleaded with the jury to see through the other's alleged misdirections, culminating in a tense wait for the final verdict. When the jury returned, the room was charged with an almost tangible gravity. News cameras lingered outside the courthouse, capturing every shift in expression on the faces of spectators. Ultimately, the jury found Chris guilty of first-degree manslaughter and concealing a corpse, a verdict that sent a wave of emotion, both relief and sadness, through the assembled spectators. Kelly's mother openly wept, clutching a small pendant containing her daughter's photograph. The defense team, by contrast, quietly announced their intention to appeal on the grounds that the forensic evidence was inconclusive and that prejudicial references to Chris's other charges tainted the jury's perception. Nonetheless, the immediate reality stood. Chris faced a substantial prison term. During the sentencing phase, prosecutors painted a picture of a manipulative individual who not only caused or allowed Kelly's death, but also attempted to erase any record of her existence afterward. Chris's attorney sought leniency, arguing that while his decisions had been wrong-headed, they were the byproduct of addiction and panic rather than a deliberate intent to kill. The presiding judge, however, made it clear that dumping someone's body in a remote field without alerting authorities, especially someone with whom one was ostensibly in a caring relationship, required a measure of accountability commensurate with the gravity of the loss. In the end, in December 2018, Chris Zacco was sentenced to 31 years in prison for the murder of Kelly Dwyer.